They expected anger. That was the first mistake. The Galactic Council chamber had seen wars declared, empires dissolved, entire species judged and erased. Its vast circular hall carried the weight of civilizations millions of years old, beings who had conquered stars before Earth had even formed oceans. Power here was not subtle. It was displayed, measured, and enforced. And on that day, it was used to humiliate humanity. The human delegation stood at the lowest tier of the chamber, a symbolic placement reserved for emerging species. Above them, layered in ascending rings, sat the dominant powers of the galaxy, biomechanical overlords, ancient hive intelligences, energy-based collectives that had long abandoned physical form. Their fleets spanned light years. Their weapons could rewrite planetary surfaces in seconds. Humanity brought none of that presence. No projection of force. No overwhelming technological spectacle. No attempt to compete in the language the Council understood. Just one ambassador. Still. Silent. Watching. The first voice came from a species that had not lost a war in 12,000 cycles. Its tone carried amusement more than hostility. They spoke of human fleets. Primitive, they said. Observable. Bound to physical space. Trackable by even the most basic sensor arrays. Another voice joined, sharper this time, dissecting human strategy. Linear. Predictable. Dependent on formations and visible positioning. A doctrine, they claimed, that had no place in a galaxy that had already moved beyond such limitations. Laughter followed, not loud, not chaotic, but controlled. The kind that comes from absolute certainty. A third representative expanded the insult. Humanity, they argued, had mistaken scale for strength. Building more ships instead of transcending the need for ships entirely. Investing in fleets that could be counted, mapped, and destroyed. To them, visibility was vulnerability. And humanity was entirely visible. The council chamber dimmed slightly as a projection filled the central void, comparative displays of military capability. Alien armadas appeared as shifting clouds of energy, decentralized, adaptive, impossible to pin down. Next to them, human fleets were rendered as fixed formations. Structured. Finite. Outdated. The conclusion was delivered without hesitation. Humanity was not a threat. Not now. Not in any foreseeable future. A relic strategy in an evolving galaxy. All attention shifted downward. The human ambassador had not moved. No interruption. No defense. No attempt to challenge the narrative being constructed around them. That silence began to stretch. For a moment, it created something unfamiliar in the chamber, uncertainty. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The presiding entity demanded a response. Not out of respect, but protocol. Humanity was being given the opportunity to justify itself. The ambassador finally spoke. No elevated tone. No emotional weight. No urgency. They did not address the accusations directly. Did not argue against the analysis. Did not attempt to redefine their position in the Council's hierarchy. Instead, they acknowledged it. A different strategic philosophy, they said. One not immediately visible. One not designed for comparison within existing frameworks. It was not an explanation. It was a statement. And it changed nothing in the chamber. If anything, it reinforced the Council's conclusion. Evasion was interpreted as limitation. The inability to explain was taken as the absence of anything worth explaining. The dismissal came quickly after. Future conflicts, the Council decided, would proceed without consideration of human interference. Their fleets, while numerous, posed no meaningful complication to advanced operations. Any engagement involving humanity would be resolved with minimal allocation of resources. Efficiency demanded it. The session moved on. Other matters took precedence. Territorial disputes. Resource allocations. The quiet negotiation of power between species that actually mattered. Humanity was no longer part of the discussion. The ambassador remained for a moment longer after the chamber shifted focus. Not out of defiance. Not out of confusion. Just stillness. Then, as they turned to leave, a final remark was directed toward them. Casual. Almost an afterthought. An observation that humanity's greatest weakness was its need to be seen. To project strength in ways that could be measured. To exist within boundaries that others had already learned to escape. This time, the ambassador paused. Not long enough to draw attention. Just enough. And then, without looking back, they responded. Understood. Nothing more. No warning. No correction. No attempt to reclaim dignity. Just acceptance. By the time the human delegation departed the council structure, their status had already settled into irrelevance within the minds of those who remained. A minor species. Predictable. Limited. Already accounted for. Already dismissed. Across the galaxy, human fleets continued their standard operations. Patrol routes remained active. Defensive formations held their positions. Trade corridors were monitored with the same visible presence that had just been mocked. Everything appeared exactly as expected. Every ship in place. Every signal accounted for. Every system functioning within known parameters. And then, without transition, they were gone. Not destroyed. Not scattered. Not recalled. Gone. Entire fleets vanished simultaneously across multiple sectors. No delay between systems. No sequence. No escalation. One moment they existed. The next they did not. No debris fields marked their absence. No energy signatures indicated weapon discharge. No gravitational disturbances suggested sudden movement. Even the most advanced sensor arrays, capable of tracking particles at quantum resolution, returned the same result. Nothing. As if the ships had never occupied those coordinates at all. Initial reports were dismissed as error. Faulty readings. Calibration failures. The kind of anomalies that occur when systems attempt to interpret impossible data. But the reports did not stop. They multiplied. Independent networks confirmed identical losses. Different regions. Different observers. Same outcome. Human fleets, everywhere, had ceased to exist. Command structures across the galaxy began immediate verification protocols. Long-range scans intensified. Historical tracking logs were reanalyzed for inconsistencies. There were none. Up until the exact moment of disappearance, everything had been normal. Which made what followed impossible to categorize. No known weapon could achieve this. No known technology could remove entire fleets without trace. Even total annihilation left signatures, radiation, distortions, remnants of energy transfer. This left nothing. Worse than nothing. Absence. Human space itself remained intact. Planets continued transmissions. Civilian traffic moved without disruption. Infrastructure showed no signs of attack. Only the fleets were missing. And humanity offered no explanation. No distress signals. No emergency declarations. No request for aid. Silence. What had been dismissed hours earlier as irrelevant suddenly became the only subject that mattered. Because something had happened. And no one in the galaxy understood what it was. Confusion did not last long. It evolved into calculation. Across the galaxy, strategic cores began running projections the moment confirmation became undeniable. Humanity's fleets were gone. Not weakened. Not displaced. Removed. An absence, in a system built on power balance, created opportunity. The first reactions were cautious. No empire moved openly. No one declared an advance into human-controlled space. Not yet. The lack of evidence made every conclusion unstable. If this was a collapse, it was unprecedented. If it was an attack, the weapon was beyond comprehension. But hesitation never lasts in a competitive system. Quiet mobilizations began. Task forces assembled at the edges of human territory, holding just outside official boundaries. Long-range weapon platforms were repositioned under the justification of defensive readiness. Recon units were dispatched with strict orders to observe, not engage. Every major power wanted the same answer. Was humanity gone, or exposed? Initial probes returned nothing unusual. Human colonies transmitted routine data. Trade routes remained active. Civilian infrastructure showed no sign of panic or disruption. There were no emergency evacuations. No defensive escalations. It was as if the disappearance of their entire military had not registered as a crisis. That detail unsettled analysts more than the disappearance itself. A species that had just lost its fleets should have reacted. Even the most controlled civilizations would show some shift in behavior. Increased communication. Defensive coordination. Something. Humanity did nothing. Which suggested one of two possibilities. They didn't understand what had happened. Or they did, and it wasn't a loss. That second possibility spread slowly at first, then faster. Sensor arrays were recalibrated to search for non-standard signatures. Deep field scanners pushed beyond conventional detection thresholds. Exotic particle tracking systems were activated, tools normally reserved for studying theoretical phenomena. And then the anomalies began. Minor at first. Easy to dismiss. A distortion in a remote sector that lasted less than a second. A gravitational fluctuation that had no identifiable source. A sensor echo that appeared, resolved into something structured, and then vanished before it could be classified. Individually, each event meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Something was moving. Not through space in any measurable way, but across it. Appearing for fractions of a moment, then disappearing without transition. No acceleration curves. No entry signatures. No exit traces. Just presence. Then absence. A listening post on the edge of a disputed system recorded the first clear incident. For 0.8 seconds, its sensors locked onto a solid object inside restricted space. The reading was precise: mass, structure, energy output, all consistent with a human warship. Not a fragment. Not debris. An intact vessel. Before the station could initiate a response, the contact vanished. Not moved. Not destroyed. Removed. The data was transmitted, verified, and immediately escalated. Reactions were no longer cautious. Emergency sessions were called. The same council that had dismissed humanity hours earlier now convened under urgency protocols. Priority channels flooded with fragmented reports, incomplete analyses, and one growing conclusion no one wanted to formalize. Human fleets had not been destroyed. They had become something else. Attempts to track the phenomenon intensified. Predictive models were adjusted to account for intermittent presence. If these appearances followed a pattern, it could be mapped. If it could be mapped, it could be countered. But the pattern refused to stabilize. Contacts appeared in unrelated regions with no consistent interval. No directional flow. No clustering that suggested movement from one point to another. It wasn't transit. It was selection. Locations were being chosen, not traveled between. And every time a human vessel appeared, it did so inside controlled space. Behind defensive perimeters. Within zones that should have been inaccessible without detection. The implications were immediate. No border could hold. No sensor could warn. No defense system could respond in time to something that did not approach. Panic, once restrained, began to surface. Not openly, not in declarations or public statements, but in the behavior of those who understood what this meant. Fleet commanders adjusted formations without explanation. Defensive grids were reinforced in ways that assumed internal breach rather than external assault. Strategic assets were relocated away from predictable positions. Every move carried the same unspoken assumption. They were already vulnerable. Requests for clarification were sent to Earth. Direct. Indirect. Diplomatic. Covert. None were answered. Human communication channels remained active, but they carried only routine traffic. Civilian exchanges. Commercial data. Nothing that addressed the disappearance. Nothing that acknowledged the growing instability across the galaxy. That silence began to feel deliberate. As if humanity was watching. As if they were waiting for something. Then came the second confirmed incident. A fortified system, central to one of the most powerful empires, detected a brief incursion. This time, multiple contacts. Not one ship, but several. All inside the inner defense perimeter. All present for less than a second. The system's automated defenses activated, but there was nothing to target. By the time weapons systems aligned, the contacts were gone. No damage. No attack. Just proof. Proof that access was no longer restricted by distance, speed, or detection. Proof that whatever had happened to humanity's fleets had not removed them from the galaxy. It had removed the galaxy's ability to stop them. That was the moment the interpretation changed. This was not a disappearance. It was a demonstration. And it had only just begun. The shift from uncertainty to understanding did not happen all at once. It broke through in fragments. Different civilizations reached the same conclusion through different paths, some through physics, others through pattern analysis, a few through instinct refined over millennia of war. The data did not align with destruction, movement, or concealment within known limits. It aligned with absence from the framework itself. Human fleets had not been hidden. They had stepped outside the system that defined detection. The first formal model came from a species that had spent its existence studying dimensional anomalies. Their analysis was cautious, heavily qualified, and immediately dismissed by half the council, until the predictions began to match observed behavior. Human vessels were not traveling through space. They were exiting it. Not completely, just enough to remain connected while avoiding interaction. A shift into a higher dimensional layer where conventional physics lost authority. A state where distance, trajectory, and exposure no longer applied in any measurable way. That explained the disappearances. It also explained the appearances. Re-entry did not require approach. It required selection. Coordinates could be chosen without crossing the space between them. Presence could be established without warning because there was no path to detect. The implications spread faster than the explanation. Every defensive doctrine in the galaxy depended on anticipation, tracking movement, predicting vectors, preparing responses before contact. Even the most advanced systems relied on one constant. Everything had to arrive before it could act. Humanity had removed that requirement. They did not need to arrive. They simply appeared. The Council tried to quantify it. If the duration of re-entry could be measured, perhaps a response window existed. If energy fluctuations accompanied the transition, perhaps they could be detected early. Neither assumption held. The transition left no precursor signal. No buildup. No distortion that could be isolated from background noise. The moment of appearance was the first and only indicator. And it lasted less than a second. Less than the time required to confirm the data, let alone respond to it. Simulations collapsed under that constraint. Every scenario ended the same way, defense systems activated after the point of vulnerability had already passed. The galaxy had spent thousands of cycles optimizing reaction speed. Humanity had made reaction irrelevant. Reports continued to accumulate. Short-duration intrusions across multiple systems. Military installations. Command hubs. Strategic resource points. Every location that mattered had been touched, briefly, precisely, without repetition. There was no damage. That was what unsettled them most. If this had been an attack, it would have been over. No fleet could defend against an enemy that chose where and when to exist within engagement range. Entire empires could be dismantled before a single coordinated response could be organized. But humanity was not attacking. They were demonstrating. That distinction carried its own kind of pressure. Because it meant restraint. And restraint implied control. The first direct message arrived without broadcast. It appeared simultaneously within secured communication systems across multiple civilizations. No signal origin. No transmission path. It was simply there, integrated into networks that were supposed to be isolated from external interference. Authentication protocols failed to identify intrusion. Because there had been no breach. The message was brief, calm, structured, unambiguous. We are no longer operating within observable space. There was no elaboration, no technical breakdown, no attempt to justify or threaten, just a statement of position, and a shift in understanding. The council reconvened, but the atmosphere had changed. The same entities that had spoken with certainty now processed information in silence. Not out of confusion, but because every conclusion led to the same endpoint. They had no counter, no escalation path, no defensive adaptation that could restore balance. Any attempt to engage would rely on systems that had just been proven obsolete. For the first time in recorded history, superiority had become undefined. Not because power was equal, but because one side no longer existed within the scale being measured. More reports followed, each reinforcing the same reality. Human vessels appearing deep within secured territories, near command centers, adjacent to fleet formations, within orbital defense grids. Always brief, always precise, never aggressive. They were not testing limits. They were showing that limits no longer applied. A central empire, one that had led the mockery, attempted to respond. Not with weapons, but with positioning. They redistributed their fleets, abandoning traditional formations in favor of randomized dispersal. If targets could not be predicted, perhaps vulnerability could be reduced. It changed nothing. Human contacts continued to appear exactly where they mattered most. Not randomly. Not inefficiently. Deliberately. As if every movement, every adjustment, was already known. That realization settled in quietly. If humanity could observe from outside detection, then nothing they did was hidden. Not strategy. Not preparation. Not fear. The advantage was not just invisibility. It was awareness without exposure. The message that followed did not expand on the first. It didn't need to. We can be present wherever required. That was enough. Because everyone understood what had been left unsaid. There was no distance anymore. No delay. No warning. The council had mocked what they could see. They had built their dominance around it. And now, for the first time, they were facing something that could not be seen at all, but could see everything. What followed was not war. It was the collapse of the idea of war. Across the galaxy, fleets remained in position, weapons armed, command structures active, but none of it meant anything anymore. Every system designed for conflict depended on a shared understanding that both sides existed within the same space, bound by the same rules. That assumption was gone. Humanity had not increased its strength in a way the galaxy could measure. It had removed itself from the scale entirely. And in doing so, it had made every opposing force irrelevant without firing a single shot. The response from the major empires was immediate, but restrained. Not out of discipline. Out of necessity. There was no target to engage, no trajectory to intercept, no strategy that could guarantee even a moment of advantage. Any aggressive action carried a risk that could not be calculated. If humanity chose to respond, there would be no defense. So for the first time in collective memory, power held itself back. Not because it wanted to. Because it had to. Humanity did not press the advantage. There were no surprise attacks, no dismantling of infrastructure, no sudden collapse of hostile governments. The fleets that could appear anywhere, at any time, did not use that ability to dominate. They used it to define a boundary. It began with presence. Simultaneous, precise, undeniable. Human vessels appeared across multiple strategic systems at once, within orbit of military worlds, inside defense perimeters, adjacent to command centers that had never been breached in their entire existence. They did not fire. They did not deploy weapons. They existed. For just long enough to be seen. Then they were gone. The message did not need translation. Every system that had been touched understood the same thing at the same time. Access was no longer restricted. Distance no longer mattered. Defense was no longer protection. The council convened again, But there was no debate this time. No competing arguments. No attempts to reinterpret what had happened. The structure of power they had relied on was no longer stable. Humanity had not attacked. It had demonstrated control. And control, without opposition, was absolute. The final communication came without disruption, without force, without intrusion alarms. It was simply present, as if it had always been part of the systems receiving it. Clear. Direct. Final. Conflict persists only where it can be contained. We no longer operate within containment. There was no threat in the wording. That was what made it effective. Because it wasn't a warning. It was a fact. War, as the galaxy understood it, required engagement, forces meeting, exchanging, overcoming. It required visibility, interaction, consequence. Humanity had removed all three. They could engage without being engaged. Act without being opposed. Observe without being detected. There was nothing left to fight. The realization spread beyond military command. Trade networks adjusted first, recalculating risk models that no longer applied. Border systems deactivated long-standing alert protocols that had become meaningless. Entire doctrines, built over thousands of cycles, were archived within hours. Not because they were outdated. Because they no longer described reality. Some species attempted to adapt. Experimental technologies were pushed forward, efforts to replicate or counter what humanity had achieved. Dimensional studies accelerated. Sensor systems were redesigned to search for what had no detectable signature. Progress was made. But it was slow. And humanity was already finished. They did not expand aggressively. Did not claim territory or enforce dominance through occupation. Their presence remained intermittent, controlled, deliberate. Enough to remind. Never enough to provoke. The balance of power did not shift. It dissolved. Because power could no longer be compared in terms the galaxy recognized. And in that absence, something unexpected formed. Stability. Not enforced. Not negotiated. Accepted. For the first time, conflict was not avoided because of deterrence, or fear of retaliation, or strategic disadvantage. It was avoided because it had become impossible to execute. Humanity had not won a war. It had made war obsolete. The council chamber, once filled with layered voices and constant assertion of dominance, grew quiet over time. Decisions still happened. Alliances still formed. Disputes still existed. But every action was taken with an awareness that had not been there before. At any moment, without warning, without resistance, humanity could be present. Not as an aggressor. Not as a participant. But as a constant. Watching from a place no one else could reach. The final record of that session did not describe a victory. It did not declare a new ruler of the galaxy. It did not redefine hierarchy or assign control. It documented a change. A single conclusion agreed upon without objection. Humanity had not disappeared. It had stepped beyond the reach of everything that once defined power. And in doing so, it had already won.